Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the All-Inclusive podcast with Jay Ruderman.
Hi, I'm Jay Ruderman. All-Inclusive is a podcast focused on inclusion and social justice. Join me as I interview leaders and experts on the latest news focused on advocacy for social justice. In order to make progress that will lead to a more equitable future, honest discussions must be held. That is what All-Inclusive is all about. Listen and subscribe to the All-Inclusive podcast on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, and anywhere else podcasts are available. Visit the show website for more information and full episode transcripts at www.allinclusivepodcast.com.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 281, Praying with Fire. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And today we are returning to our recurring series on new books that have been coming out, some fiction, some nonfiction, that look at the Jewish world in interesting new ways. And today our guest, Rachel Sharona Lewis, is the author of a mystery novel that features a rabbi. Now, this might sound a little familiar to certain people of our listeners, because there is a series of books about a mystery-solving rabbi that were very famous back in the day. They're by a writer named Harry Kemmelman, and they feature a rabbi named Rabbi Small, who lives in Massachusetts and solves all kinds of mysteries that happen in this very dangerous community that he's the rabbi of, using Talmudic principles and ideas and logic. And our guest today has written the first in what I hope and I think will become a series of novels, a series of mystery novels featuring a very different rabbi. Her name is Vivian Green, and she solves mysteries in the very dangerous community of Providence, Rhode Island, where Lex lives. So, Lex, watch out. There's a lot of layers in this novel, and we're excited to get into some of the nitty-gritty in our conversation. So before we do, just by way of introduction, our guest today, Rachel Sharona Lewis, is not only an author, but also has a day job working for the Boston Jewish Community Relations Council, where she is director of synagogue organizing. She has worked to engage synagogues in campaigns focused on gun violence prevention, affordable housing, and increasing investment in renewable energy, as well as her more recent work with the Boston Jewish community in terms of supporting and welcoming and allying with immigrants. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Rachel Sharona Lewis has also recently launched her own podcast. It's about women's basketball, and it's called Hoop We Can Believe In. So we're really excited to get into this conversation and its many levels. So Rachel Sharona Lewis, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
So good to be here.
So I'd love to hear a little bit of the story about how you came to write this book.
About 4 years ago, I was on vacation in a small Massachusetts beach town on the North Shore. And my wife and I stumbled upon a library sale where this library just dumped all of its books out onto its yard. And we started looking through it. And I noticed the Harry Kemmelman Rabbi David Small series pretty quickly. The rabbi title really pops out. And I started reading it, and I was just standing there for half an hour, enthralled in the writing about this conservative rabbi who was so unabashedly Jewish and wonky about Talmud. And I was hooked. And the whole series was basically for sale for like a very small amount of money. I bought it and I read through them all pretty quickly. And it was so familiar. I just knew all the characters, even though these books are actually they were written in the 60s and 70s and 80s. They somehow just really spoke to my own experience in Jewish institutions and in many of the rabbis that I had interacted with. And what struck me so much was that in each book, it's almost as if Harry Kemmelman, the author, was really just using the genre of mystery to comment on the Jewish community at the time. He was dealing with assimilation and with the role that he thought that the Jewish community and the conservative shul that he was setting this in should play in things like the civil rights movement and how Jewish ritual could match up or not match up with the feminist movement. And these are all dynamics that are true to our world, too. We're consistently dealing with some of these same questions. There's really nothing new under the sun. At some moment, as I was reading through these, devouring them, I started getting my own visions of a contemporary female rabbi who was queer. And these scenes just started coming to me that really were reflective of some of my own life and many of the people that I know, the shuls that I've been in, the meetings that I've been in. I have been someone who has written in various ways, more like writing blogs when I study abroad about everything I'm seeing. But there was something about this genre, there was something about this story, the character of Rabbi David Small, that was an invitation to play with that and recreate it. And it did feel a little bit like taking this set of books that actually are quite beloved by like a lot of people in the Jewish community and trying to make them real and contemporary in our time, actually being able to create that connection to the original books plays into the strengths of this book in a really big way.
The commentary that you describe, I mean, I've read your book. I haven't read those earlier books. That's something I've got to do. But now, I mean, those will read as prequels for me now, which is a fun way to do it, right? But the commentary you're talking about on Jewish life now in your book, what I thought was cool about it is I think if somebody is coming from a place of cynicism about Jewish institutions, they would see themselves in your voice and in some of the characters. And they would also feel pushed because I think there's a little bit of optimism about Jewish life too. And I'm flipping it in a bunch of directions. If somebody comes from like a place of, oh, I love my synagogue, I love Jewish life, things are so great, there's a lot of ways in which they're going to be pushed and sort of asked to see in some of the kinds of people that are involved in Jewish life some not only positives, but some questionable characteristics too. And I thought that it was this really sort of rounded portrayal of a lot of different kinds of folks when it could have just fallen into a trap of like either Jewish life is dandy or Jewish life is diseased and terrible. It played this middle ground. So coming into that, I'm curious to hear, like, how did you create that? Like, you set the book in a particular city that I love, in Providence, Rhode Island, where I live, and you could have set it in just like a hypothetical city that was meant to represent like every town. So I'm curious about that. But like, how did you go about crafting this community and thinking about what characters would play a role in your story, representing different kinds of Jews and also folks who weren't Jewish?
I grew up in an Orthodox community in Northeast Philadelphia, and I had a mom who, when it came time for me and my twin sister to be bat mitzvahed in our Orthodox shul, and this was not an open Orthodox shul, she negotiated with our rabbi to make sure that we could actually speak to the whole congregation rather than just have brunch on Sunday with all of the women, where we give a pretty short Devar Torah, pretty short sermon. And we, as a result of that conversation that she had as a very learned woman who in her own right, I think had felt not always seen by the Orthodox world, she made it possible for me and my sister to be the first women at 12 years old to ever speak in the sanctuary of that shul. I think in a lot of ways that story is really telling of how me and other members of my family have positioned ourselves in Jewish community and the ways that we have felt invested in institutions. I don't necessarily myself right now belong to a shul, but I work with a lot of synagogues in my day job, and I work with a lot of rabbis and have a lot of friends who are rabbis. And I see consistently the leveraging of the resources of the Jewish community, of Jewish institutions, in some cases for good. And it's not always for good, but I do believe that it actually is really possible. For the past 4 years, have been organizing Jewish communities into solidarity efforts with people in immigration detention. And shuls that have been able to be involved have gotten into hosting people coming out of detention in the houses of members, and have raised money to bond people out of immigration detention. And this can certainly happen and does happen outside of the realm of faith institutions. But inside of it, it can also be really strong and augmented. Also, just laying my cards out on the table, I'm, a queer young progressive Jew who is a part of like this indie minion over there, an independent prayer community that's egalitarian. I'm a part of activist groups within the Boston area. I've sort of dabbled in all of those different places.
I'm not actually even sure how to formulate this question, and I certainly want to be careful to avoid spoilers. I always want to be careful of that. So I want to ask it in kind of a vague way, but like I'm thinking about how, as we talked a little bit about before we started recording, that a piece of fiction has the potential to be a kind of a fantasy version of the world as we hope it would be or wish it would be. Is that how you're thinking about it?
I think that this book both exists within the genre of mystery, and I think in my own mind, it is a bit of a fantasy, a niche one at that. Rabbi Vivian is a rabbi who, to me, seems really familiar to a lot of wonderful rabbis that I know who are, inside of these institutions trying to make things happen. One of the things that happens in the book, one of the storylines, is that the shul congregation Beth Abraham in Providence, Rhode Island, owns a vacant piece of land. And that piece of land, there are a lot of different visions in the congregation of what could happen with it. And she tries to really steer it in a direction where that land can be made available for good purposes and to really become a resource to a broader constituency within the city of Providence. That storyline within the book feels to me reflective of like, there are these real things about this congregation, Beth Abraham. There are real things about a lot of other congregations that could really be leveraged in a big way for good. And I think I see that happening, as I've mentioned before, but I also feel like it is a thread that sort of gets into fantasy to some degree. And I hope, I have real hopes that's a place that we can go. And I also don't think that that's contingent on Jewish institutions. I think that there's also another storyline in the book around the role that police play in our communities and the conversation that happens around that between Rabbi Vivian Green, who is the protagonist, our amateur sleuth, if you will, and congregants and her senior rabbi above her, Rabbi Joseph Glass, and also other members of the Providence community who might have a different experience of the police from her and many of the congregants in her community. Like those conversations where they end up landing also feel to me to be reflective of the kind of world that I want to live in. And it's not really even about where things end. It's about the conversations that we need to have around what the costs of our choices are, which becomes like a really big part of the book and a part of the grappling that is happening within Rabbi Vivian and a lot of the other characters in the book.
So I was really struck by Rabbi Vivian, by Vivian's character. So for a few reasons. One, I'm a rabbi recently ordained who lives in Providence, Rhode Island, and spends a lot of time doing activist things. Which
you
is
are
like,
Rabbi Vivian.
There's ways in which Well, so on one hand, I see so much of myself in her. On the other hand, I seriously don't see myself in that I am not working for a synagogue context. And in many ways have sort of crafted my life around specifically not that I think those things are terrible, but just that I have found that other pathways of work for me in Jewish life are a better fit. And that's sort of where I want to go with this is she herself struggles with what it is to be a rabbi of a mainstream kind of synagogue. And she is what I think of in my head. This is how I think about myself. As a straddler in many ways. And when I talk about myself, I say this in Providence all the time because I think some of the other rabbis in Providence or the Jewish institutions in Providence, I don't know if they would say I'm sort of deeply involved in Providence's Jewish community. I think I am. But the way I do that is I spend a lot of time with Jews who are not particularly involved with the institutions of Providence. And what I sometimes do is also go to synagogues and spend time in those spaces. But I loved hearing from you. Maybe it's weird to say I love this. I loved hearing that you're not a synagogue member, because I think that provides a voice to a set of people who are not always centered in Jewish fiction that is really important. And at the same time, most of the characters in your book were institutional Jews. They were board members or synagogue members or rabbis or etc. And so I was curious to hear from your perspective, like, where do you see yourself in this? And where might readers see themselves in this? And what are some of the questions you're hoping people might be wrestling with about Jewish institutions, about how we've set these ecosystems up, whether it's in Providence or anywhere?
Yeah, the word straddler feels really appropriate for me too, because I'm not necessarily positioned in a particular community. I mean, so I will say there was a storyline in this book that I cut out that was Rabbi Vivian having these sort of like monthly bar gatherings with young Jews / people who were like a part of the Jewish community, but not themselves Jewish, studying Torah together in this bar. And I ended up taking it out because it didn't feel like it served the purpose of the story. But a lot of the characters made their way into other little pockets of the book. I think that there are ways that questioning, like, what makes a Jewish institution valuable to our broader community, was a question that I was dealing with. And I really wanted to show the possibility of one that, in my opinion, was really worthy. And I think the jury's out. I think the jury's out on whether or not that's like true. But I think that exploring that felt like the way to go, rather than building up this sort of alternative world that Rabbi Vivian was trying to create in the bar with the Jews and Jewish adjacent folks that didn't end up in the book. One of the things that I'm really excited about with all of this is that this is going to be a series. I've started working on a second book, and I really appreciate how working on a series can allow you to go down other paths that you might not have gone down in the first book. And so I think in the future, Rabbi Vivian might end up getting a bit jaded. I guess that's a spoiler, but not a huge spoiler, I don't think.
I was actually wondering a little bit about sort of what you could call the economics of writing Jewish fiction. Lex noticed that you had gotten a grant from Hadar to work on this book. I don't know if it was a large grant, but I wonder, like, if you could talk a little bit about that. Are there grants available out there for people writing Jewish fiction? But I really feel strongly that we need a lot more Jewish fiction, a lot more, and specifically about this like fantasy version. That I think it somehow, if we can put out there a vision of what it might look like, what it might feel like to have a Jewish world set up in a way that is better, that'll help a lot of people move toward it, because it's hard to imagine something that you've never seen. And one way to help people see something is to tell them a story about it. And so I feel like we need more of it, but I also know that it doesn't pay very well. So can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about being a Jewish fiction writer, knowing that also means that you have to have another job?
Yeah, I self-published this book. I had dabbled a little bit in the world of brick and mortar publishers, or whatever form they exist in these days. One person told me, who works for a mystery publisher, said, "This is great. It's totally a cozy mystery. You just have to add 10,000 words, never curse, and take out any references to sex." And I was like, I'm not doing any of those things, but thank you for telling me that I could, and maybe it's publishable at that point. So I had interacted a bit with the world of publishing, and just became really clear that I could try to do this on my own. I learned a lot from a podcast about self-publishing that really set the process out for me, and got a little bit of funding from Hadar as an alum. It's not specifically about fiction or writing, which I'm grateful for. But this was really like a self-propelled project. And I, at this point, feel like really good about that. I think that I wanted this to be something I had full control over. I wanted to make sure that the cover was going to be was going to harken back to the original Harry Kemmelman books. I didn't want to take out any of the curses. I wanted this to really portray the world that I wanted to portray, and the characters that I wanted to spend time with and wanted to introduce to other people. And so for me, self-publishing worked. And it works also because I do have another job. It's not necessarily my plan in the world to be a full-time writer. I wrote this book mainly in the mornings between the hours of 6:30 and 8:30 a.m. Over the course of a year or two, when my wife was living 3 hours away from me. So an opportunity really opened up to have the time to do that. But I also want to say that I was writing this book as though I didn't even know it was going to become a book. I was writing at a time when our world felt so dark, and having a practice of imagination, having a practice of writing that actually brought up the possibility and brought up the question of like, what do I want? What do I want to work towards? What do I want our institutions to look like? And just get to work on a mystery and get to like create new characters dealing with different questions was so healing. And it was a really important outlet for me. And so I appreciate the point you made, Dan, about how we need more fiction. We need more visions of worlds that don't yet exist, which is a real strength of fiction. But I also just want to put in a plug for writing as a practice of imagination, because I did not see myself as a fiction writer. And then I just started writing, and then I was a fiction writer.
Yeah, you really just shifted something for me, and I appreciate it a lot, because your description of the process of writing as being separate from maybe the process of publishing or sharing is so aligned with one of the things that we've been talking about, which is just this shift in the way that Judaism is practiced from large organizations to small communities, small groups. But in a sense, what you're talking about is even the next level, which actually I've had some other conversations recently with people who are doing various kinds of programs that elsewhere in the Jewish world might be thought of as leadership training programs. And the idea is if you're doing a leadership training program, then people must go off and create a little organization or a little group or whatever. And as we were talking about that, I said, so is everybody in this program, going off and creating small groups? And well, most people are, but actually one person is doing a podcast and one person is doing a zine or something like that. And just if we could imagine, thousands of people writing their own novels, not even as a intention to spread it around, but just as their own sort of spiritual practice. And then, of course, some of them would end up being published. It starts to give me, a feeling of a different world.
I recently tried my hand at some short stories, and I wrote this short story that was in response to this movie, Happiest Season, that came out a few months ago. It's like a Christmas movie, but with two women. It's like a Meet the Parents sort of situation, two queer women. And so I wrote a story about a Jewish couple, two women. One brings her partner home for the first time, and I am like sitting there with this story right now, and I don't really know what to do with it. And the thing that I want to do with it is have other people write stories about cross-cultural, queer, Meet the Parents, holiday events, and then like share them and see where that leads. But I'm definitely wondering now about, like, outside of the context of publishing and the way that we tend to think about it, what are the ways that storytelling within our own contexts can be like an invitation for other people to share those stories, and how much more so would my own story be enriched by seeing people writing about the same topics and seeing some of those characters side by side. So I'm very interested in where do we sort of go from here outside of the context of becoming a published author from the big five or whatever people say, and just using fiction as a way to connect and share stories without it feeling like there's such a high bar to entry.
In addition to all the angles that your book brings up around Jewish communities, Jewish institutions, their relationship with others, there's a set of political questions that you approach that I thought was really just, it brought so much. And in particular, there's an election that happens with a variety of different kinds of candidates that represent different kinds of ideas and voices. Really, they speak to broader political debates of our time, to questions of sort of liberalism and leftism. Really, really interesting. And just I'd love to hear from you how that piece came together and how you went about approaching some of these really timely, really important questions around politics that were right there in your book alongside and intertwined with all of the Jewish institutions and their questions that you brought in.
I think the election was a part of the book primarily because I wanted to put the synagogue in conversation with broader institutions within the city. No synagogue exists within a vacuum. There are a few storylines that really shifted in the editing process. So, for instance, there's a storyline around the relationship that Rabbi Vivian and the synagogue and Joseph Glass, the senior rabbi, have with the police. And the mystery of the book is that the shul catches on fire during Shabbat services. And the tendency in many Jewish communities is when we're under threat is to, seek out protection from the police. And there's definitely reason to believe that this was an act of anti-Semitic violence. And so we're grappling with this piece. And at the same time, one of the significant characters is Raymond, who is the custodian of the shul. And he's Black, and we get to know him and his family and a different side of the city. And his son, for various reasons, ends up being pretty engaged in activism against police brutality in the city. And these two dynamics end up really in tension. And there's a broader community that becomes present in support of this work to try to reallocate funds from the police to other institutions within the city. And as I was writing this, at this point, like a year and a half ago in the editing stages, that culmination, that moment at the end, it was a meeting that took place between Mac and his comrades in this activism and the police chief. And it was actually, they were advocating for an oversight committee of the police. And because of the moment that we were living in with the racial uprising, it became really clear to me that the meeting that they were going to have should not have been with the police chief. It should have been a city council hearing. That's what was happening in our world. And that's what I wanted to grapple with. That's what I was grappling with. And that's what these characters, as existing in a particular time and place, were grappling with as well. And so for me, it was important to try to not be that preachy about things, but to really try to reflect back the same questions that we are asking in our communities and in our cities. And I also just want to say that it was important that this actually be located in a real place, in Providence, as a real city, and not just a made-up town. In the original Harry Kemmelman books, he makes up this town of Barnard's Crossing, which is like a North Shore beach town with a up-and-coming Jewish community. And I wanted this to feel like a real place that we could see, that we understood and could navigate, and where there are a lot of different groups of people who are living their lives. I also want to just share that another storyline that really shifted in this book was that I finished the first draft of this book right before the Tree of Life shooting happened in Pittsburgh. And originally, the threat of anti-Semitic violence was a lot smaller. And so just speaking to how this became, writing this book was a way for me to digest what had been going on in the world, I really had to change that part and take that threat more seriously.
A little while back, we had two guests on our podcast who are also authors, Amy Lucido and Sophia Pasternak, and we talked with them we were talking more about kids' literature with them, but in general, I think a lot of Jewish literature is looking to shine a positive light on Jewish institutions. And it's not that you're doing the opposite. I want to make that clear. It's not like this book exists to say like, oh, synagogues, oi. But you force readers to ask some important questions about how are white Jews relating to non-white people, to non-Jewish people? Like what are some blind spots there? What are some serious mistakes that can be made on that front? When I think of my, dream world of all the Jewish fiction books that would exist, sort of like Dan would, it's not just that I want to carve those incredible visions of what Judaism can be. It's also I want to say, look, here's what this is. Like, here's what's going wrong right now. And there's something vivid about experiencing that through a story that I think is powerful in a way that just talking abstractly about important issues isn't. And so I really want a future where there's lots and lots of books that say, look, not in prose, but like through their stories, say, look, there's really serious issues that we need to wrestle with as Jews right now and with others, Jewish and not. And so what I want to ask you is, what's hard about that? Like, have you gotten feedback from folks, or were you worried about feedback from folks that like, wait, you're making some Jewish characters look kind of sketchy? Like, are people going to read your book and be anti-Semitic? Like, have people voiced that concern to you, or was it something you were worried about in writing? And I guess, like, how would you push folks, or would you push folks to overcome those concerns in favor of making some of these storylines that do ask really hard questions?
I haven't gotten that many critiques of that particular nature, which I think is more reflective of who the audience has been. I think that for a lot of people who are young, queer, Jewish, some set of those things, that this book really like spoke to a lot of people. And I think that because of the ways that I tried to balance liberalism, progressivism, and have some real like empathy, I hope, towards all of those people, I think that for the most part, the reaction of the audience that this has gotten to so far has been really positive. I think the most controversy that this book has stirred up, the piece that I've gotten the most critical feedback on, is Vivian's questionable commitment to halakha. There is a particular storyline that a lot of people have brought up to me, where she has this rule that she made up, where she will eat fried chicken that is not kosher 2 times a year, not 3, because if she did it 3 times, that would mean that she was sort of committing to the practice of eating non-kosher chicken.
I loved this, by the way. This was one of my favorite things. So I'm just like I'm shaking my head. I just want to tell listeners, like, I loved this, and I'm so like mad that people were upset at this. I understand where they're coming from, but sorry.
Well, what's interesting is some people were like a little upset about it, but some people actually just didn't believe that would happen. Some people were like, that's not a thing that a conservative rabbi would do. And I think in a lot of ways, the gymnastics that Vivian is doing with her fried chicken rule, that I think funnily comes up in the context of a date initially with her love interest. I think I was actually trying to do something very particular, which was really like portray her halachic observance as not the primary factor in judging how good of a rabbi she was. That she applied Jewish logic and Jewish rules to her transgression. But I think in terms of all of the other pieces of the book and whether or not that stirred up questions or controversy, I'm open to that. And I think that it will come as the audience broadens and is not mostly young progressive Jews. And I'm really open to those conversations. I really hope that they take place, because the tensions around, the costs between protection of Jewish institutions and who will or will not feel welcome as a result of those choices are real. And in this book, they're really located in relationships. This isn't vague. The question is like, will this custodian and his family, who are real members of our community and have been for a really long time, will they feel comfortable? Will Jews of color feel comfortable coming to our community if we have police waiting out front? These are real questions that we're all dealing with and grappling with. And so I do hope that part of what this book can bring up for people is the question of where are some of these issues located in our own relationships and in our own worlds, and what choices are we already making around them?
One topic that comes up in your book a little bit quickly, but that I don't want to rush past, I want to make sure it gets into the episode, is Vivian's relationship to sport. There's this piece where we hear about her relationship to the Cincinnati Bengals. It's a fascinating little thing. And I, B'nai Lappi likes to talk about donkey stories and how if you were a donkey, you'd always notice all the things in Torah that are talking about donkeys in a way that people wouldn't notice. And so I'm a big sports fan, and so I notice my sports donkey stories. But I wanted to bring it up because you and I recently shared something together. You were the administrator of an NCAA tournament pool for the women's NCAA basketball tournament, also known as the NCAA basketball tournament, or at least it should be. And I wanted to bring up that fact because A, I love talking about sports, but B, there's been some public discussion recently, both in the context of the women's NCAA basketball tournament and in the context of women's soccer, related to discrimination in sports. Your book doesn't talk about the basketball tournament or about soccer, but it does talk about misogyny. So I was curious, before we go, if you could talk a little bit about how that plays in your book. And if you want to just slip in your thoughts about sports and Judaism a little more, that's always welcome on this podcast.
I think Rabbi Vivian, like many young female rabbis and young non-cis man rabbis, just experiences a lot of microaggressions, of misogyny, of bigotry in ways that are kind of hard to name. One of the things that I tried to do to really highlight this was include a few other women clergy in the book who could really affirm this experience for Vivian. So she has two friends, a Unitarian Universalist minister and an Episcopal priest, who all brunch together every now and then and commiserate about the sexism that they're experiencing in their congregations, and really affirm for each other that what they're experiencing, whether it's being one of the rabbis in the room, but never really being referred to as rabbi, whether it's somebody touching your pregnant belly, that these are unacceptable moments, and that it's very difficult to be in a pastoral role where you're affirming other people's experience so much, but at the same time being deemed invisible or being deemed inferior. And I think that's a very particular experience to women and to queer clergy, and really wanted this book to show that, the way that she wields her own power, the way Rabbi Vivian wields her own power and invites other people into the investigation of this fire, and how she challenges so many of the men within the shul, within the city, who have a particular vision of what happened, is really supposed to be some form of medicine against that misogyny. And I hope that it comes off in that way. And on the sports front, Yeah, it's awful. We're learning so much about how much misogyny there is in sports and professional sports, and in the inequities between the investment in women's and men's sports. But it's also just a really fascinating time. I mean, I have never followed the NCAA tournament before, but this year was just like a really clear moment of reckoning for so many people because of what was exposed and what was made public. And it feels to me like what is happening in the world of women's basketball in particular is kind of reflective of what's happening in Judaism in the ways that you guys sometimes talk about it, from what I've learned from the podcast. And there's a real possibility of like innovation. There's real possibility of new kinds of investment. We see that with the players, with these amazing athletes who are awesome, by the way. You should just watch NCAA women's basketball / NCAA basketball and the WNBA, because they're amazing athletes who can do incredible things and are really good teammates to one another. It feels like there's this moment where things are changing and more people are paying attention. And we might have a different landscape of professional basketball and how women's basketball plays into that. So I feel really excited to have explored that this year, to have discovered it this year. It kind of reminds me of when I discovered egalitarian Judaism in college, when I realized that women could lead and women could read Torah and women could do all of these things that men could do. I now know this about women's basketball, and I feel very grateful and just want to make a PSA that we should all follow women's basketball because it's great. They also have always been at the forefront of athlete activism, and they deserve a stronger fan base.
Thank you so much, Rachel Sharona Lewis, for joining us. This has been such a great conversation. Loved talking about your book and talking about these other intertwining issues. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation. We hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this conversation first by reminding you, get this book, The Rabbi Who Prayed with Fire. There are links from the show notes on our website that can help you buy it. You can also Google it. Great mystery and a great look into Jewish communal life and all sorts of other important topics for our day. So check it out. We really encourage you to do that. And the last thing we'll say is that we love it when you out there are in touch with us with any questions, any comments, any thoughts you have about our episodes. And you can do that in a whole bunch of ways. First, there are our social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can head to any of those via @JudaismUnbound. You can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And you can always email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We are, of course, so grateful if you are able to support us financially also, and you can do that by heading to JudaismUnbound.com/donate and making either a monthly recurring gift or just a one-time donation. And the last note that we will end this episode on is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.